Hi, my name is Eleni Stamou and I'm based at Aston University in Birmingham. I work as research fellow on the Achieve project, and today I'm going to present a paper entitled Included but Not Fully Belonging: Ethnic Minority Young People and the Limits of Inclusion in Secondary Schools in England. The paper is based on the research we did in schools, which involved interviews with teachers and young people in three secondary schools in England. The research in schools was carried out during 2018-19 and 2019-20. Just to give you a very brief view of what was happening in the UK in that period, so the wider socio-political context was by and large dominated by the EU referendum. There was social division and fierce political public debate around these issues on whether to remain or depart the European Union. It was a period of political instability. We had snap parliamentary elections, changing prime ministers, and finally, on the 31st of January 2020, the UK officially departed the European Union. The Brexit debate uh, brought to the fore issues around migration, sovereignty, austerity, and in this context, issues of diversity featured prominently. One other note in relation to the UK context that I would like to make is in relation to education policy around issues of race and racism. So, as it's been commented and as Paul has described it, policy around these issues is pretty much non performative. So, to a great extent, he argues, it's brought to the forefront only at moments of race crisis, and even then, it's typically displaced into inquiries and reports and enacted through exhortation and good intentions rather than practical actions, and is often subsumed within other standards raising moves. So, from this point of view, it's a form of non performative policy making. Throughout our interviews with young people, we captured ethnic minority young people being positioned at a liminal state, balancing between feeling included and feeling excluded. One of our research participants vividly illustrated this position in terms of feeling included but not fully belonging. We also observed that there were strong boundaries between the cultural practices that young people engaged with at school and the cultural practices that they were involved with in their home lives. So we observed that in some way, ethnic minority young people had to live one part of their identities at home because it wasn't recognized, it wasn't valued, it wasn't considered useful or significant in the school context. I'm going to discuss these observations um, as related to some other parameters that emerged through our research too. One of them is a limited understanding of culture and the approach to cultural diversity predominantly in terms of ethnic and religious affiliation. And on the other hand, the workings of cultural deficit models, particularly in the way that teachers dealt and understood diversity in the everyday school lives. Our qualitative interviews with teachers showed that they uh, perceived the culture and diversity mainly through the prism of ethno-nationalism. So, in a way, they made sense of cultural diversity mostly in terms of ethnic and religious affiliation. And they talked about dealing with diversity in the school lives in terms of making some adjustments to allow the expression of diverse practices with an emphasis on religion. One example below is from a social sciences teacher and assistant principal in the urban school who said, "We have a room devoted, which is their worship room, where they can go and do their Friday prayers. They have different time periods for the girls and boys. They have their washroom where they can do their ablutions. We've tried to accommodate it in the school. During special periods of time, for example during Ramadan, we are allowed in 16 plus to wear their religious wear underneath their jackets. It still meets the school expectations, but we are compromising so they can express who they are and what is important to them." So this shows that the mainstream approach in the school context was that they were inclusive, but at the same time, this inclusivity was also perceived as a compromise on behalf of the institution. On the other hand, our interviews with young people revealed that cultural diversity was experienced and perceived very differently uh, between ethnic minority pupils and ethnic majority pupils. In the case of ethnic minority young people, we observed that they felt partially included, and this feeling of inclusion was related to the opportunities that they had to express their identities, mainly their religious identities, in the school context. One example is Isa, a 16-year-old in the urban school, who said, we can practice our culture in school. Like, for example, we are allowed to wear scarves, which is very important for us because in some schools you may not even be allowed to wear a scarf or you might get picked on for wearing it. In certain schools, there are some incidents like that. In our school, I think they are very open minded about it. On the other hand, the ethnic minority young pupils also referred to the limits of these experiences, and they described how these were not universal experiences and they didn't apply to every single aspect of their cultural identity. Uh, on the other hand, the ethnic majority young pupils, they discussed issues of cultural diversity in a very different way through a focus on the visible manifestations of culture, such as food, flags, and festivals. Um, One example is Rahma, a 70 years old in the urban school, who said, I think when you're putting your sum on to check your money for buying food and stuff, there's little posters like World Brazilian Day or something, and they will sell like Brazilian food in the restaurant and stuff. The posters are cool, but I don't think they actually do anything. It's just for show. The actual thing is a bit of a letdown. So they mainly understood cultural diversity through these visible expressions of culture, and they also ironically also pointed to the limits of this approach on behalf of the school. Another parameter that I would like to add to the discussion and which emerged through our fieldwork in schools is the occurrence of cultural deficit approaches to minority culture and cultural learning more generally in schools. We capture teachers while talking about cultural learning, deploying stereotypical approaches to cultural diversity, and they portrayed pupils as lacking and in terms of culture and being held back by their cultural background. So, in these cases, they understood their role in terms of expanding pupils' learning experiences and cultural horizons, and in a way replacing um, the culture that they had in the context of their families with more valid and valuable forms of culture. One example, again from the urban school, there was an incident around homosexuality, and while discussing about it, the social sciences teacher and assistant principal said, "We've got to bring down those barriers." So, in that sense, when we are broadening their horizons, try to educate them about that, and not sticking to their principles or their foundations, which they might have had at home. Another example came from Ben, a drama teacher and head of drama in the urban school, who said, I think in a school like this, meaning in a very diverse school, I've been here a long time and culturally within families, particularly within Islamic culture, there is a big barrier to any kind of performing arts. That is a wall here. It really is. It's a difficult wall for people to break through, for staff to break through. It really is. In these cases and many other cases that we came across, cultural identity is perceived as posing barriers and needs to be replaced. And we also observe the ethnicization of certain attitudes. which is attributed in a very generalized way to certain ethnic or religious groups rather than being understood as emerging or as related to certain forms of deprivation like economic deprivation, educational disadvantage, etc. So overall, through our qualitative research in schools, we found that the dominant approach to inclusion that was practiced in the context of schools consisted of making reasonable adjustments to accommodate diverse culture with a predominant focus on religious practices. This was a form of inclusivity that was underlined very much by a sense of compromising. And in this way, it worked on sustaining existing dividing lines and further producing dividing lines between us and them. Additionally, we observed the occurrence of dividing lines between young people from the ethnic majority groups and young people from the ethnic minority groups. And that was related to the way they experienced their and performed their cultural identities. In the former case of the ethnic minority young people, we captured them as being in a constant process of constant negotiation of their cultural identities. On the other hand, the cultural majority young people, they had a sense of having a cultural identity that was legitimate by default, and they were mostly focusing on performing this taken for granted form of cultural identity. Also, in relation to cultural diversity, we observed that issues around diversity were accompanied by celebratory rhetorics and discourses in the school context, but at the same time, in practice, they were perceived in some cases as hindering some of the school values. Finally, we found instances of ethnicization and stereotypical portrayal of cultural diversity as a barrier that holds pupils back and thus needs to be replaced. And that was related to the occurrence of cultural deficit models that we discussed earlier. To conclude, our research revealed a tick boxing approach to inclusion, inclusion as a list of requirements to be implemented by the school, and we argue that this approach is both short sighted and ineffective. It perpetuates rather than interrupts the dominant normative and narrow patterns of culture and belonging. Developing a sense of belonging for young people requires and is based on meaningful recognition of cultural diversity and its value. So, as a way forward, we suggest the expansion of inclusion. Through, first of all, through destabilizing existing and established systems of what Bourdieu calls symbolic domination. Denmit refers to a process of divestment from middle class, white versions of culture and creativity. There is also a need to shift to more infusive forms of practice, uh, forms of practice that recognize and incorporate diversity across all levels of the system. So, in the school context, uh, the incorporation of diversity and its reflection at the school staffing, at the school curriculum, and at the everyday lives in schools. Finally, last but not least, inclusion cannot travel far unless it's linked with the removal of the barriers which emerge from the workings of inequalities. Thank you very much. I hope we'll have time for further discussion, questions, and observations later. Thank you very much.